It is 9 minutes past 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and we are pleased to welcome to the microphone a man whose name you may recognise because he used to do a bit of work for, there's apparently another radio station in Geelong called, is it Croc? Is that what they call themselves? Croc?
Yeah.
Yeah. Apparently he worked for Croc for a little while, but these days he is also writing books, and his name is Steve Woods. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning. It's very nice to be back in Geelong.
And we're very, very pleased that you chose us instead of the other lot. Steve, I have a book here in front of me, which I'm now waving in front of the microphone so everyone can see it. It's called For the Record, Australian Pop Culture. That was the first of 3 books. We'd like to talk to you about the series, and we'd like to talk to you about particularly the one that's just about to arrive or has just arrived in on your website. But let's take it back to the times where you were involved in radio and stuff in this town. Talk us through.
Well, I suppose in a way these books actually started in Geelong. I was doing a morning show on that station that plays a crock of hits.
Yes.
I had a segment every morning called The Classic 9 at 9, where we used to look back at a particular year and we play 9 songs from a particular year and talk about stuff. And what I started, this is pre-internet, and I started to make sort of notes of what sort of happened back in 1977. And then I realised that when we came to play 1977, a couple of months later, I've already done that information. I need to find new stuff, and so I kept adding to it. And then as years go by, I end up with sort of these sort of huge files on sort of amazing trivia of sort of how we all grew up and how all this sort of stuff sort of became the soundtrack of our lives. And I then gathered all my bits and pieces together, and I ended up going to Triple M for a while. And then,
what did they do?
No idea.
Apparently not. Oh, you mean that you don't have no idea? I thought they have no idea. Sorry. Yep. They're a radio station as well, I think.
Oh dear, Neil, you are in. He's very grumpy this morning, Steve. I apologise. I think he's nervous because his Brisbane Lions might get beaten by our Geelong Cats today.
It'll be an interesting match.
Yes, it will.
Sorry, back to you.
I ended up at a company that actually specialises in syndicated radio, and what they do is they build radio shows that go all over Australia. And things like Take 40 Australia with Barry Bissell, you might recall. I was brought in to do a program called Nights with Alice Cooper, which was good fun. And also I started another program called My Generation, and that became the biggest radio program in the country. It went to air on another radio station up in Melbourne that starts with GOLD.
Heard of them as well.
Yes, but the idea was let's go back for a couple of hours and we'll look at a particular year. So lo and behold, I'm using all my Geelong notes for this. And John O'Coleman used to actually host it, and he really loved not so much sort of like who the new Prime Minister was back in that year, but he wanted to know about sort of like the top 5 TV shows that were happening, stuff that was really happening in your backyard. And so that became the challenge to make the thing as Australian as possible, because when you go and find research books on pop culture, you will find that they are either published in America or they're published in the UK. So their version of pop culture is talking about the Ramones or the Buzzcocks and all sorts of stuff, but there's no talk about the Divinyls or Skyhooks or In Excess. And so that's where I stepped up, and I thought, well, I've got to start writing these books. Otherwise, our culture, I believe, will just slowly start to fade away. And there's hundreds of thousands of people that loved all this stuff, and it's great to sort of keep it alive.
Steve, it's an interesting point you make, and I'm glad you are a bit of a champion for this, because one of my frustrations is growing up and being so proud of the uniqueness that we have here in Australia, but the longer I've lived, the more we're trying to pinch other parts of the world and we're killing off our own. So what you're doing is taking us back to what made us feel good about being an Australian through the 60s and 70s.
Well, and the other disturbing thing is, and this is a worldwide problem, is there are no bands in the charts anymore. There are sort of solo artists that have basically been manufactured through the record companies, and the record company has greater control over one person rather than a band. But there's no Doobie Brothers or Dire Straits coming through the ranks. So, and I think that's an enormous concern, I think. And there's nowhere for these places to play, to get practice, to go on a TV show and realise how to work the cameras. We had a golden era, and I think it's important that we actually hold on to that as much as we can.
Because if you look at those television shows that are on, I think of The Voice and Australian Idol and Australia's Got Talent, brackets allegedly, close brackets,
Yep.
they only ever have solo artists.
Occasional duet, but yes.
Yeah, you never see a band on there like you would have in the old Countdown days.
Well, and that's the thing. And this, if you go back and have a look at those old Countdown clips, you suddenly realise there's an art to. I was talking to Gene Simmons about this when I was doing interviews for that for those radio shows. Owning the stage and standing there with your sort of legs apart and your arms wide out, taking up as much space as you possibly can, so that the person at the back of the room can actually see you. Don't be there like sort of curled up in a corner somewhere and not going near the audience. It's like you've really got to get out there and touch them. And there's a stagecraft which I think sadly we're sort of seeing fade away.
It's interesting though. Rob presents the entire program in that position, standing up in front of the microphone.
I own my space in here, Steve.
Yeah, it works a treat with his audience.
I can see him from my place.
Yeah. Yes, that's not the Statue of Liberty. That's Rob Cameron.
Now, Steve, I'm just flicked through and already the memories come flooding back. So for you putting it together, how difficult was it not to be distracted with your mind taking you other places while you're trying to collate this stuff?
Oh, it's impossible. You go down a million rabbit holes and you start off thinking, I suddenly have a memory of cartoons that I used to watch on a Saturday morning or on Cartoon Corner with Daryl Summers all those years ago. And before you know it, then all of a sudden you're onto Star Wars, and then all of a sudden you're onto who won the grand final in a particular year. And what I've actually included in the first book is even who even sang at the grand final and
yeah, I noticed that.
What tours came through, how much were the tickets, who supported them, and just sort of try to make it like if you were growing up in that period, this is basically your backyard. So that was the first book that came out, and there's a chapter for every year between 1964 and 2017. The weird thing is when people flip through it, and this is probably more of a psychology test, people tend to gravitate to the years that they had when they were in their formative years, in their teenage years. For me, my teenage years were basically the years of Countdown, 1974 to 83. That's where I live, and I think the best music in the world was released in that sort of 10-year window. People slightly older than me will say, no, haven't you heard of the Beatles? And people younger than me saying, oh no, what about Boy George? None of us are incorrect. It's whatever is relevant to the individual. So people will flip through. They'll find that little window, and they're saying, "Oh my goodness, this is what I was doing when I was growing up," and that's where it really sort of grabs you by the throat, I think.
It's interesting. Last week we interviewed a bloke called Stephen Skeins, and he has what we've done here, Steve, is I've told everyone how I know so much about music by having Steve Skeins on last week, and now I'm telling everyone how I know about what happened in various years because we're having you on. So I have no credibility left at all. But Steve was talking about 1968 as being the year of music, and I think he is 3 or 4 years older than me. So he would be the same age as you then, Rob.
Yes, correct.
So, yeah, it lines up with what he's saying, that 1968 was undoubtedly the best year of music ever.
Oh, yeah, look, he's probably right. I mean, it was absolutely prolific, and it also just the amount of releases that we now look back on as being classics. They all still stand up today, and for radio, it's always been a bit of a problem where your kids will say to you, "Oh, you're still playing, all that old stuff." But old stuff is so good, though, and so it was very hard for radio. I think in the sort of the 2000s, we sort of had radio that was always doing the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then all of a sudden you get to the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s. I believe those years weren't as potent as what they were back then, but then again, that's my opinion.
An opinion shared, I think, by most sensible and intelligent people, Steve.
No, well, logic backs it up, Steve. I think the quality of the music and the music styles sort of fitted, and maybe because the whole industry's morphed, but let's say even beyond 2000, the music's just all over the place, and it's hard to define a a best of, if you like. It's just got a bit chaotic. So I might be my age, but I always go back to your era, and that's where the real cream of this, of particularly Australian musical industry, was.
Well, it's kind of heartening to sort of think that the vinyl music shops are popping up all over the place now, and kids are actually going back and discovering, a Dark Side of the Moon album, or a Sticky Fingers or something or other, and sort of being able to sort of take it on face value. In fact, I think vinyl is outselling CDs in a lot of areas at the moment, but also shows the quality of the CDs that are being released.
It might also have something to do with the fact that if you buy a vinyl album, it's 10 times the price of buying it on CD, so they don't have to sell 1 in 10, and they're lining up in dollars.
Well, I've gone back to vinyl, and I must admit that when I go into vinyl shops, I'm thrown back to when I was a teenager, flipping through and looking at album covers from about the top sort of 3 centimetres of the cover as you flip through to work out, no, oh, there, and also just the artwork and being able to read the back of it and see who was involved with this album, and lyric sheets and things like that. I used to devour that stuff. Yeah,
lyric sheets changed the industry, where you could actually understand what they were singing, so you could then join in with them.
Particularly Australian crawl.
Yeah, because most of the time it was just mumble through it. But yeah, that was revolutionary. I remember that. I love that time.
I think a problem area has also been this thing where you can just download a song for free, and if you don't like it, then you delete it. So you don't actually spend any time with it. Where I know that I've bought many albums over the years where I thought, I'm not sure about this, and then you listen to it 3 or 4 times, and all of a sudden it becomes your favourite album.
Yeah. And quite often there's a track on it that was never released as a single, but it becomes your favourite track, and it's unique to you because you only heard it in your lounge room as opposed to regularly on the radio. They're the little gems I love.
Bondi Road by Dragon.
Oh, absolutely.
What a fantastic album that is. And Bondi Road is the best song on the album, by a street. By a street, Bondi Road. See what they did there?
And Dragon at the time were probably at the stage of their career they didn't expect probably to do something so good because of so many hits beforehand.
Yeah, we had Mark Hunter's birthday recently, and he was a featured artist, and that's a band that I look back now and think they were grossly underrated. They were extraordinarily talented.
Very, very good.
And the only reason I bought that album was I was in a shop and I was going to buy something else, and the guy said, "Are you a Dragon fan?" I went, "Yeah." And he said, "I've got a signed Mark Hunter, Todd Hunter copy of Bondi Road." And I bought it, took it home, thought, whatever.
And played it and loved it.
Loved it, yeah. It's a great album. 89, I reckon that was. Sorry, back to you.
But I think because we spend so much time with these albums, they become part of us. Again, when I was at this company that was doing all the syndicated radio shows around Australia, they were looking for a vehicle for Barry Bissell to host. And I went to the boss and I said, you know what, we have so many countdown shows which are focused on the singles that are going up and down the charts. I said, funnily enough, when people mention Skyhook's Living in the 70s, I mentally think of the album. I don't think of the single.
Yep.
And it's because I've been to so many barbecues over the years where people put on an album or put the cassette on in the car, and I know every track on that album in order. And I know that, this song's not quite as good as the next one, so I'll hang around for it. Where these days, because you only have the availability to sort of just download the one song to see whether you actually like that album or not, I think it's a real shame. And so anyway, that developed into a program called Cover to Cover. And that went all over Australia as well, but very much just geared on, let's spend half an hour where we'll go through the first Crowded House album and really talk about who played on it and how it all came to be, because those things are really important to a lot of people.
That's a great memory you brought up. The incredible radio voice of Barry Bissell.
Yeah, for sure.
Magnificent.
I'm assuming Twisties didn't host the episode that covered living in the 70s?
We did all sorts of things on that show.
that particular sponsorship might have gone down badly. Now, we've only got as far as your first book. We haven't got a whole heap of time. Tell us about your second and, more importantly, your third one.
Well, I put the first book out, and it went gangbusters, and it was terrific. They were selling in sort of Dymocks and all those sorts of places. The the second book, I suddenly started getting emails saying, but what about all your music trivia? This is all, you've given us all the kind of the pop culture stuff, but what about all the music stuff? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, you always used to talk about different sort of artists that used to play on songs and that were uncredited and things like that. It took me back to as I said, when I was doing the show Nights with Alice Cooper. Alice tours every 2 years, and he would find himself back in Melbourne. And Alice is a mad golfer. He could play probably professionally if he wanted to. He's alcoholic, so he stays off the grog, and so he's into his food as well. So he would spend hours in with us doing interviews about everybody, and he's like your favourite uncle. He has stories about everybody, everything. He was there. And he talks about the early days of Alice Cooper songs, Alice Cooper records. At the same time, he'd started a drinking club called the Hollywood Vampires. And it was a drinking club with John Lennon, Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees, Harry Nilsson, and various others. The way you got into this drinking club, you had to drink them under the table. And he said that when they were based in Los Angeles, he said there was about 3 or 4 studios that were working all the time. And he said, but you'd be making your album. In the next studio, the Eagles might be doing their album, and down the corridor, you've got Fleetwood Mac doing their album. And he said there's a lot of downtime, and you'd be wandering in and out of each other's studios saying, play us what you just recorded there, and we'll have a listen to it and see if it's any good. And he said that John Lennon turned up when he was in that sort of, what they call it, the Lost Weekend.
Lost Weekend, yes.
And he said, play me some of this early Alice Cooper stuff. And so they played it. And John would say, no, the middle 8 on that's wrong. You've got the chord progression in the wrong order. I'll fix it up for you. Then all of a sudden, Paul McCartney turns up one day looking for John Lennon. And Paul McCartney's probably the best drummer in the Beatles. And he would say, hang on, let me do the drums for you on that. Alice Cooper maintains that he has every Beatle playing on early Alice Cooper albums, but he said they were so drunk at the time, he can't remember which songs, which Beatles. And I've always enjoyed that story. I'm sorry, I'm getting to the point. So the second book came about, and I thought, what about an A to Z of your favourite artist, their classic hits, but who were the uncredited people that were helping out on that particular song? So there you had your trinity. You had to have the artist, the song, and the uncredited artist. And if you were missing one of those pieces, the story doesn't become quite as good. But so the A to Z was put together, and I was finding out stuff on albums that I just had no idea was happening. I got to talk to some amazing people, getting them to recall who was in the studio when they were recording that. I found myself talking to Tony Mitchell of Sherbet, who wrote all those songs with Garth Porter. And I was talking to him about the early Daryl Braithwaite days when Daryl started the first version of his solo career with You're My World and Cavalry, those sorts of songs. And I said, why did that happen? And Tony said, you can't remember. And he said, it was probably just a management decision to sort of broaden the base of Sherbet because they were so popular. And I said, who played on Daryl Braithwaite's solo songs? And he said, we probably did. And so he said, so you've got Sherbet playing on Daryl Braithwaite's solo hits. And he said, I've got a couple of stories for you. He said the song Cavalry, he said the guitar solo in Cavalry was actually done by Kevin Burridge from the Kevin Burridge Express, who happened to be hanging around the studios. And there's another ballad that they did on the How's That album, I think, called If You Walk Away.
What a magnificent song. Speaking of best songs on albums.
Yes, the lead solo on that is played by Ian Moss before he got into Cold Chisel.
Wow.
So it's just like, so I'm madly writing notes. I thought this is fantastic. So that's the second book. So it's an A to Z of everyone you can think of. And you suddenly become very aware of almost family trees, if you like, of groups of friends that clearly are artists. When the Eagles were starting out, they started out as Linda Ronstadt's backup band. And Glenn Fry was living in a flat above Jackson Browne, and they became great friends. And they actually wrote Take It Easy together. And Jackson Browne never actually joined the Eagles, although he was asked if he wanted to at the time, but he wanted to be more of a solo entity. But you suddenly realise that the Eagles then are obviously friends with Jackson Browne, they're friends with Linda Ronstadt, they're friends with Emmylou Harris, so they're all helping each other out on a lot of albums over the years, and a lot of their other friends' albums. Then you realise there's another sort of group with Fleetwood Mac, and Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham are producing albums, are singing backup vocals on lots of songs. They're friends with Warren Zevon, and if you actually have a look at a Warren Zevon album, they obviously were desperate for him to have a hit. I mean, he had Werewolves of London, but you go and have a look at some of the albums of Warren Zevon, and it's an absolute who's who of the music industry, all participating on this album, I think, to get him over the line, because when you've got Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham singing backup vocals on your single, they're giving you the sound that radio wanted in those days.
Yeah.
And so there's just so many stories about that. And that book's called Classic Hits and Urban Myths. And
Do you know why Don Felder doesn't talk to the other blokes anymore? He might be dead, but...
it's his birthday today. He's turning 77.
There's a fantastic documentary on the Eagles, and it disintegrated live on stage, where they're actually having an argument through the microphones, and it ended up in a punch-up.
Oh, nice!
And that was the end of that. So yes, I think it's a very strange beast. Rock bands. I mean, they've spent an awful lot of downtime together, shall we?
Now, Steve, I'm going to be incredibly rude and tell you that we've hit the end of our interview. What I'd love to do is if we can push it out, say, 3 or 4 weeks and use this as a prelude to actually talk about your new book. How would that work?
Yeah, not a problem at all.
Can we do that again? Because otherwise we're going to have someone grumpy, the sponsorship announcements, all that, all that sort of stuff.
And Steve, I'd like to thank you, because we probably had more of a conversation than an interview, and I appreciate the fact that you blended into that beautifully. And I hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to more.
So
absolutely. And if people are interested in the books, go to the website fortherecordbook.com.au.
That's exactly what I was going to ask you. So for the record, FOR the record book.com.au, and if you do buy a copy, and I guarantee that you will love it, make sure you tell Steve you heard about it on this show, and I reckon he might even scribble something nice in the front.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot of people ask them to get signed and things like that. But it'd be nice for some Geelong info to head back into Geelong.
Indeed.
It will. And hopefully boost up our credibility again. Steve Wood, thank you for being part of today. We'll get back to you in a few weeks and get you to come in and talk about the new book. How's that sound?
My pleasure.
Thanks, mate.
Steve.
That was very enjoyable. Good luck.
See you then.
There he is. Steve Woods, former Croc presenter and now author of a couple of really good books.